Premier, former Premier Alex Scott, the Honorable John Barrett, Ms. Laverne Furbert, Mr. Cordell Riley, Mr. Ralph Commission, Mr. Phil Parentchief, and our moderator, Mr. Rick Richardson, and we have the Youth Premier here, Ms. Mackenzie Cole Tuckett. It is my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here this evening to what promises to be a very stimulating discussion on the Pitt Report, 41 years later. We are looking forward to the reflections from and contributions from our panelists, but we are also welcoming you to give your thoughts and comments during the Q&A period. Our minister, the Honorable Levita Fogo, is presently at another function, but she will be joining us soon. We have an interesting array of people who are the panel members. We will be looking at, as we have indicated before, the Pitt Report, 41 years later. How far have we come? What have we accomplished? What's left? What are our thoughts and reflections? And so I invite you to engage your minds and your attention now, or as we hear from our panelists. Our moderator will be, he will be commanding the attention of the panelists and keeping things flowing. My name is Heather Whalen, by the way. I'm from the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs. And as I said, I am so pleased that you are here. So on behalf of the entire Department of Community and Cultural Affairs, we welcome you to this, our penultimate Heritage Month event. We actually have one more tomorrow night. And so with that, thank you for coming, and good evening all, welcome. Mr. Moderator, over to you.
Thank you very much, Director. The Pitt Report, 41 years later, how far have we come? Sets the tone for what we are about to hear. Just to tell you a bit of the ground rules for this evening. Brief introduction of the panelists. We will also have a speech off the top from the Youth Parliament Premier, who will tell us what kind of Bermuda the young people would like to see. We'll then go into 5-minute introduction from the panelist, and then we will begin our questions. The order of the panelists, we're about to get to that. We will go, Madam Laverne Furbert will start, and we will go in that order across. It would really be terrible if I didn't start with a lady. Probably not wanting to start first on this occasion. But, and of course, we will open the questions to you. We want to hear from you. Once a question is put to one of the panelists, should there be a follow-up, rebuttal, and or something one of the other panelists would like to add, we will allow that. The remarks after that will be limited to 2 minutes. So we're trying to have 5-minute openings, and then we begin. So let's have Mackenzie Cole Tuckett. She's a 15-year-old, Year 11 student at Warwick Academy. She serves as Youth Premier of the Youth Parliament, successfully completed the Future Leaders program last summer. Mackenzie Cole has a passion for public speaking and debating and plans to pursue a career in law. She has a keen interest in politics. Mackenzie.
The year is 2060. I am 56 years old, reminiscing with school friends from way back when. We've long taken our rightful place in our chosen professions. As we discuss the old days, we are smiling. feeling quite nostalgic as we share our thoughts on how far we have come as a community. That is the narrative. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mackenzie Cole Tuckett. It is indeed an honor to be here to share the vision of the Bermuda that young people will help to shape and hope to inherit. I believe that I speak on behalf of Bermuda's youth in acknowledging the significance of the various roles that we will play in continuing to mold our Bermuda. Having read the background to the Pitt report, as well as the Commission's findings and recommendations, the one thing that is clearly evident is that many of the issues that were presented in the report back in 1978 are some of the same issues that remain contentious today. That isn't to say that there hasn't been any progress. I believe that there has been progress. What it does highlight is just how real those issues were and still are, albeit to a lesser degree. So, what type of Bermuda would I like to inherit? I would like to inherit a Bermuda where there are economic opportunities available to all of those who have the vision and the drive. Economic opportunities shouldn't be limited to those who are recipients of intergenerational wealth. While economic growth can be challenging, there has been a genuine push to promote small businesses through the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation. The organization was established in 1981 with a mission of inspiring, informing, supporting, and growing new and existing businesses on the island. With regard to immigration, I believe in the importance of Bermudianizing the workforce. However, I also understand that there might always be a need for guest workers. Ultimately, Bermudians need to be educated and given an opportunity to gain meaningful experience in their chosen field, which should put us in a good position to secure our job of choice. Then there is home ownership. The Pitt report spoke to encouraging home ownership by way of housing association. I say, let's take it a step further and make home ownership truly attainable and affordable for Bermudians. I am currently a Year 11 student, and nothing is more important to me than my education. As a community, we owe it to our young people to provide a quality education system, one that provides all of its students with a solid foundation and prepares them for the real world. I believe that whether parents elect to send their child or children to public or private school should be a matter of personal choice. I also believe that we should lose the stigma that Black children go to public school and that private school is a place for white children. Social integration was a recommendation in the Pitt report. Social integration is important to any community as it helps to reduce conflict and can help us to feel more connected. What better way to celebrate unity and national pride than with the annual Bermuda Day Parade? I believe that it is important that events do not come, I believe that it is important that this event not become something of which people or organizations can capitalize, but instead be an event that celebrates Bermuda and all of her people. In addition, the audience should be more reflective of our population. And please, don't take my spot. When reading about the constitutional issues identified in the Pitt report and the subsequent recommendations, the one that stood out for me was the recommendation that the voting age be lowered to 18. This was passed in the House of Parliament in 1990. The travesty is that almost 30 years later, there are still those who do not recognize their power to instill change with their vote. At the end of the day, how do we hold our elected officials accountable? We all have a civic responsibility to vote, and you can be assured that as soon as I am of age, there will be no delaying my voter's registration. I will also encourage my friends to do the same. In closing, I would like to reiterate that we all have a part to play in moving Bermuda forward. I ask that we all do our part in contributing to that narrative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mackenzie. Thank you very much. I will read just a very brief bio as we go into the panelists. So we are starting with Laverne Furbert. Laverne Furbert has been a community activist for many years and is committed to helping those Bermudians who find themselves in unfortunate circumstances. Ms. Ferbert is presently the editor of the Workers' Voice and the administrative assistant to the executive board of the Bermuda Industrial Union. Ms. Ferbert also worked as editor of the Bermuda Times, a weekly newspaper published by the former Premier of Bermuda, Dr. Hewitt Brown. Ms. Ferbert has been a member of the Bermuda Progressive Labor Party for most of her adult life. In 1980 and again in 1983, she ran as a PLP candidate in the Southampton West constituency. In 2007 general election, she ran as a candidate in constituency 20. She has served in several capacities within the party, both at the branch level and the national level. Additionally, she spent 11 years as the secretary to opposition leaders Dame Lois Brown Evans and L. Frederick Wade. In February 2007, she was honored by the Bermuda Progressive Labor Party with a Drum Major Award for her dedication to improving the lives of her fellow Bermudians. In November 2010, was appointed to the Senate and served as Junior Minister of Education and Junior Minister for Youth, Families, Sports, and Community Development. Laverne is currently a member of the Parole Board and the Financial Assistance Review Board. Laverne Ferbert.
Thank you, Rick. I wouldn't mind if you cleared this didn't go first.
I do understand.
You want me to do this? People don't know why I shake and talk to me to hold this mic. So, first of all, I'd like to say that where's Mackenzie? She left. I mean, I need to have Mackenzie come to my house and give me some lessons in public speaking. I'm really serious. In exchange for the macaroni. Anyway, the Pitt report, 41 years later, how far have we come? Before I begin my presentation, let me state at the outset that I have lived 70 years, the bulk of these years on the island of Bermuda. I am a mother of 2 sons, 3 grandchildren, and 3 granddaughters, and 4 grandsons. The opinions that I am about to express are my opinions only, derived from my personal experience of living in Bermuda. Some will agree with me, others will not, and that's okay by me. I am one who believes that we have not come far at all 41 years after the Pitt report. We have not come far at all 41 years after the Pitt report and 42 years after December 2nd, 1977 riots, disturbances, protests, demonstrations, or whatever name one would prefer to use to describe the events of December 2nd, 1977, and the subsequent days of unrest. In fact, we have moved neither backward nor forward since the Pitt report, but in a circular pattern. To illustrate what I mean, by moving in a dangerous circular pattern, I offer the following. On December 2nd, 1977, I, along with thousands of other Bermudians, stood on Parliament Street outside at the gates of the House of Assembly, which also houses the Supreme Court of Bermuda. On December 2nd, 2016, once again, I stood outside with thousands of other Bermudians in almost the very same spot that I stood in 1977. Both times I was there to protest the decision made by the government that I did not agree with. On December 2nd, I did not agree with the decision. On December 2nd, 1977, I did not agree with the decision of the Bermuda government to hang Larry Erskine Buck-Boras and Larry Tacklin. On December 2nd, 2016, I did not agree with the Bermuda government's decision to allow a foreign entity, the Canadian Commercial Corporation, to build a new airport for Bermuda. At both times, the composition of the crowd/protesters was 99% black. And while the premier at both times was white, in the first instance, it was Premier David Gibbons and his cabinet who made the decision to hang Boras and Tacklin. And in the second instance, it was Premier Michael Dunkley and his cabinet who made the decision to build the airport. While there were some of us who were present at both times, some of those who were present on December 2nd, 2016 were not yet born in 1977. If my memory serves me correctly, both times pepper spray or tear gas was used to disperse the crowd. Some of the suggestions and recommendations of the Pitt Commission have been implemented, including but not limited to the following: the Child Development Project, more government funding for scholarships and/or bursaries, establishing a constitutional conference and abolishing the 3-year residential vote, and lowering the voting age to 18. I was confused by, I thought that happened in 2013 when the voting age was lowered, but I'm not sure. No. During that constitutional conference. Okay, and the establishment of, okay, the establishment of the post of Director of Public Prosecution, an annual festival which is specifically Bermudian, and I take that to be the Bermuda Day Parade, which we just recently celebrated. However, I do believe that even if all of the recommendations, and there were many, of the Pitt report have been implemented, Bermuda would still be a racially segregated society. The report 1-2 reads, Bermuda was also a racially segregated society. Black people were barred from the best hotels and from other public facilities. They were required to sit downstairs in the seminar. If they attended a Church of England service, they had to sit at the back. They could not use the same public lavatories as white people. Nor was the picture one simply of physical segregation. Black people were expected to know their place and be thankful for favors. The Bermuda pattern resembled that of the southern United States. That's contained in the report. That's not my words. That's Alex Scott's words. While black people are now accepted as guests in the best hotels and can sit anywhere they choose in the cinemas and in the Church of England, Bermuda remains a racially segregated society. It is true that blacks no longer have to sit at the back of the Church of England, but that is because whites no longer attend the Church of England. One only has to attend any Anglican church in Bermuda to prove my point. At one time, and I'm thinking specifically of Christchurch, Devonshire, which I know at one time had a majority of white members. Yet today, 41 years after the Pitt report, there are very few white members. If racism in Bermuda had been addressed by the government of the day in the aftermath of the 1977 disturbances, 30 years after the Pitt report, the ombudsman, Ms. Arlene Brock, would not have been able to pen a report entitled A Tale of Two Hospitals. In her report, it was clear that the hospital was still was indeed a microcosm of the island, a place where blacks and whites worked under the same roof, but not in any consistent counter-racist pattern. In my opinion, if racism in Bermuda had been addressed by the government of the day after the publication of the Pitt report, the 8-year investigation into former Premier Dr. Ewart Brown would have ended before it began. Amen. There is no one who can convince me that racism is not at the heart of this investigation, which I describe as a witch hunt. If racism in Bermuda had been addressed by the UBP government during their tenure, the OBA government would not have commissioned an inquiry to examine how government finances were handled under the former Progressive Labour Party administration. Over $1 million was spent on this inquiry, yet there was no proof of malfeasance on the part of the PLP administration. This is the same commission where the chairman, Sir Anthony Evans, on the first day of sitting, before any evidence had been presented or testimonies given, declared that the actions carried out by the Board of Trustees of Port Royal Golf Course were straightforward fraud. If the topic of racism had been addressed rather than ignored by the UBP government, who remained in power for 21 years after the Pitt report was published, our island home would not be described by so many as two Bermudas. In my opinion, Bermuda needs more white people to accept the reality that there are indeed two Bermudas. As I see it, Lynn Winfield, Tina Nash, and Lauren Haywood Bow must be joined by other whites to level this very uneven playing field that has been in existence in Bermuda since the beginning of time. Thank you.
Ms. Laverne Furbert. Next up, the Honorable John Barrett, JP. John Barrett is a consultant attorney who joined MJM in 2004, following his retirement as a partner from the law firm Appleby, Sperling and Kemp, where he had a varied practice in litigation, property law, and trust. Mr. Barrett is a former member of the Bermuda legislature, having served as an elected member of Parliament in the House of Assembly from 1993 until he stepped down in September 2011. Mr. Barrett served in several different capacities during his tenure, from government whip to cabinet minister to opposition whip and opposition House leader, and finally, upon his retirement, leader of the opposition. Her Majesty the Queen granted Mr. Barrett the right to use the title the Honourable in December 2015 in recognition of his years of service in the Bermuda legislature. John Barrett.
Thank you, Rick. And you probably could have mentioned that my first career was as a journalist, and at the time of the disturbances, I was the editor of the Bermuda Sun newspaper and scrambling to report all that happened that night and thereafter, as well as the commission hearings. And let me just pause here to say that when I reread the report for this evening, I thought it was important for me and perhaps for you as well to put it in some context, because this is 40 years ago and there have been 2 generations of voters since, and a lot of water has passed under the bridge. And with respect to this report, I want to say this, particularly in front of the gentleman who was on that commission. When you think about it and you look at that report, and given its breadth and its depth, it was a remarkable achievement in, 3-4 months that they had hearings in April and May, and then delivered a report in mid-July. And it was a as far as commissions go and reports, this ranks up there with the best of them, as well as the way it was written. That said, when I reflected on the report and all that has happened since, I couldn't help but think, much like Laverne to my right, that the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. The more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. And if anything, that's not to say that nothing was done as a result of the Pitt report, but if anything, what has happened since underscores a theme that seems to run throughout Bermuda's modern political history, which is that change is one of gradualism. And we don't tackle the big issues. We don't tackle the hard issues. And I think it's fair to say that as you go through that report, you will see that the government of the day and successive governments thereafter all tackled what I would describe as the low-hanging fruit, the safe stuff, the stuff that was easier to do than the hard stuff. And I'll get on to in a minute what the hard stuff is. And I don't want to waste my time and yours by giving a litany of the things that were taken up. Laverne mentioned one, the Child Development Project, a very good one. I mean, the development of the May 24th parade. These are straightforward matters. Well-meaning, well-intentioned, no question about it. But they weren't the hard issues that the commission raised. And what were some of these hard issues? Well, I think it's fair to say, although they didn't use the words, this issue of two Bermudas was raised front and square by the Pitt Commission, and it runs throughout their report, and the disparity between the races. Now, it's fair to say that they used, Alex, forgive me for saying this, but the language is more genteel than that we use today to describe the problem and the challenges we face. But nonetheless, they were put on the table, and in late 70s, early 80s, it was progressive. No question about it. They can't be faulted for not using stronger language and coming up with stronger recommendations. In its time, in its context, it was provocative. No question about it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but even in that day, they had the premier came before the commission in public and answered questions and gave a brief. No one was excluded. Everyone was challenged, and it was put out there. And that's a good thing. And the commission, as a result, developed what they thought was a blueprint for how Bermuda could become a better place. I mean, they used the word social integration and how we could be a better integrated society. Even that in itself is becoming, I wouldn't say passé, but it's not, doesn't get to the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem, which is that we need to have a community that addresses the problem of disparity between the two races. And it has been a challenge for every administration that has come since this report was delivered. There have been two governments along the way, two parties in power, but there have been, and I total it up, 10 different administrations along the way. And they've had their challenges, and they haven't all followed the blueprint. What were some of the things that were front and center of this report? One of them, the conclusion, if I can put it, was that Bermuda ought to be preparing a timetable for independence. Now, we flirted with that. We had a referendum that failed. There have been other fits and starts, but we've never gotten that off the ground. We've never prepared. And some might say it is important to prepare, if for no other reason than some of the external challenges we're starting to face today. We need to be, and we've got to ask ourselves, are we prepared? Are we united as a people? And I'd be surprised if anybody answered the question with a resounding yes, whether we are united as a people. And some of the other things they put forward that haven't been touched is an inheritance tax. An inheritance tax, one that's a lot steeper than the one we currently have, in order to start. Sharing the wealth isn't something that directly happens as a result of an inheritance tax, but it does start to level the playing field. The other thing they mentioned in the report as well was income tax. My goodness, that too is a child not looked upon favorably in Bermuda. And there may be good reason. I'm not here to push any one of them. I'm here to point out the things that the commission saw and and the way in which they tried to address them, and the fact that over the years they haven't really been pursued by successive governments, at least not successfully. And one of the things that they touched upon, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart, is political reform. They had a litany of things that had to be faced, and some of them were front and center, like lowering the voting age, doing away with the 3-year residency vote, trying to equalize the constituencies and the votes so that they become equal. At that time, we had, as you know, dual-seat constituencies, and some were larger or some were smaller than others, but all returning the same representatives, and that needed to be addressed. And they recommended a constitutional conference to get on with these things, including allowing for political AG and certainly developing a director of public prosecution so that criminal matters would be the purview of an independent prosecutor. And there were other things as well. And interestingly enough, they talked about setting up committees of the House of Assembly that would be cross-party committees to tackle issues, I think they listed planning, finance, and the environment. They were talking about revolutionizing the way in which the opposition and the government, the shadow ministers and the ministers, work together on different issues. They didn't have any solid ideas, but they were certainly pointing in the direction that they thought needed to be taken if we were going to stand a chance of trying to tackle some of these problems. That's my interpretation, not theirs, because it wasn't a long chapter in their report. But they certainly raised it, and they put that front and center, because one of the things they deplored, they decried in there was, how did they put it? The bitter animosities that seem to be about in Parliament, in between politicians, in terms of addressing problems. And they recognize that we're never going to get through if we continue on that path. I'll make no comment as to whether we're on or off that path, but I'm sure you can make up your own minds without any help from me. And then the most interesting thing of all is some of the issues that were then there still remain today. I think of education and what they had to say about education and just something like the infrastructure of the public schools. And that's an issue that's front and center today in Bermuda, because it hasn't been tackled. We haven't taken public education as seriously as we should all these years. And today we pay a price for it. Another thing that they recognized that was going to be a challenge, and always be a challenge, and it always will, is the matter of immigration and people coming to Bermuda, and on what terms and on what basis. And indeed, they said in one stage, it's, and I hold no brief, but I say, isn't it interesting how the more things change, they stay the same? They talked about children who are stateless in Bermuda and how that's soul destroying, and that ought to be addressed. Here we are 40 years on with the same problem, the same challenge, and here's the point that I think we need to acknowledge, the same difficulties in addressing it as a community, as a united community, and there's something that needs to be done by us in respect of that. I've covered most of the points that I wanted to cover in my opening remarks. Rick, have I used my 5 minutes?
You certainly have, sir.
And then some. I shall stop at that point and turn it over to someone who I think should have tremendous insight and tell us what was really going on when they wrote their report and what was left out. Thank you.
So the Honorable John Barrett is turning it over to another Honorable. The Honorable Alex Scott has had a long, distinguished political career, culminating as Premier of Bermuda on July 28, 2003. His tenure ushered in an era of community awareness, unity, and transparency of government. Alex Scott has many notable achievements, earned him enormous respect among colleagues. He pushed for cross-ministry initiatives that kept Bermuda on an even keel, a 60-issue social agenda, sustainable development, public access to information and government's CITV. Internationally, he spoke passionately with Commonwealth leaders in the UK, the Caribbean, the US, and reinsurance executives to assist small, vulnerable economies, addressing the devastating effect of natural disasters. Now, a pilot program based on this concept is in place in the Caribbean region. Mr. Alex Scott.
Thank you very much. No matter what my colleagues have said or the moderator has instanced, my qualifications for being here tonight is that I'm still here. Out of the entire Pitt Commission group, 3 of us survived. Professor Benton in the UK, Walden Hughes, the secretary here, and yours truly. It is fitting that we're having this gathering, and I have to congratulate you folks for being here. Some may have come for edification, and in my case, some came for comedy. To see if the old man still is standing. Laverne said that we haven't come far. Well, first, I said it is fitting that we are here in the Dr. Gordon room in the BIU. In 1946, Dr. Gordon lobbied, organized, and fought to have a royal commission in Bermuda. He went to London to pursue the initiative because he saw then and felt that it was an important tool to address the powers that be on the social issues that existed then. In the case of achieving his goal of having a royal commission, he was unsuccessful. 30 years later, Dame Lois Brown Evans put it all on the line once the assassinations have taken place. The convictions had them were pending. She demanded that there be a royal commission, and it was not given just for the oxy. I make the point that power concedes absolutely nothing without a struggle. It didn't in the case of Dr. Gordon, and it didn't in the case of many folks until Dame Lois, backed by the Progressive Labor Party, backed by all of the Bermudians who were concerned about what was happening in their community. And when the fight was won, meaning when it was agreed that there was to be a royal commission, then Parliament ratified the point and it was to be so. Once we had the royal commission, the fight went from the outside for it and the inside for how it was going to be managed. I want it to be appreciated that, and especially for I was going to say the younger folks, but in my case, everybody here is the younger folks. I want it to be appreciated that none of the benefits, few of the benefits that you are achieving and experiencing now came without sacrifice, struggle, tenacity. And I say that not to look back, but to challenge you as you go forward. It's now your generation. The first fight we had in the commission, and this is, the commissioners came from overseas, the chairman, Lord Pitt, Professor Benton, and one gentleman who sat quietly throughout the entire thing, said nothing, did nothing, but observed. That would have been the individual who would report back to Whitehall on what was transpiring. Again, the fact that we are and were a colony was omnipresent. We had subpoena powers. That meant anyone requested to come couldn't refuse. And so again, this was a first for Bermuda. The ministers, the powers that be, the proverbial 40 thieves, anyone in government, if requested, they had to be in attendance. And I make that point to say, for the first time, the public of Bermuda were empowered. They had authority for the first time against those who had had authority over them. But the challenges that we faced within went as far as one of the commissioners, Dame Lewis, has taught us never to repeat the libel, so I won't share with you the name of the commissioner that Government House sent a messenger to us on the eve of leaving that this particular commissioner couldn't go, his house was not in order. It was devastating for him. And I asked, can I represent you? And normally he would have represented himself. He was a fighter of the old order. But he was so put out by the fact that we are about to board a plane and he's been asked to step down. And I sent a message back to Government House that he was going to go with us. Because remember, we were sworn in, and the nature of our powers and authorities as commissioner, no one should attempt to intimidate us in the conduct of our work. So he went with us. And the first day that we got to the UK, the word came that the Royal Gazette was going to do an expose on this particular commissioner. And I turned to the chairman and said, that story shall not and will not run. Chairman said, well, you know, we have no pause on those back in Bermuda. And I said, well, you don't have power here because we have all agreed and we're going on strike. And the Pitt Commission went on strike. And when we returned, the word was that the story would not run. And the Pitt Commission would proceed. I guess I wanted to be appreciated that those recommendations that came out of the Pitt Commission. One more thing. The format. We were told when we were greeted by our colleagues from the UK that the interviewing was going to be done by a lawyer who would come out, join us, and he would conduct the interview, the questioning, and the direction that the commission would go. And I said, well, he may come out, but he's not going to be the one who, in actual fact, asks the questions and conducts the Pitt Commission, because I, for one, have to answer to Lewis Brown Evans and the PLP folks. And if you've been to Central Committee, you know I fear them more than I fear you. It was decided that all the commissioners then would conduct the interviewing, and the lawyer never made his appearance. My concern then and my observation now was that attempts were being made to contain the Pitt Commission to the point that us as commissioners would have basically just been signatories. We would have just ratified whatever the commission concluded after its 6 weeks deliberation. But to the credit of those who came out from the UK, the way that the commission proceeded is that the first 1 or 2 days, each one of the commissioners were allowed to vent. I told my tale about Bermuda. Reggie Cooper told his tale about Bermuda. John Irvin Pierman his. Walter Robinson his. And I'm leaving out someone. All of us gave our point of view. And the result was that Professor Benton, the scribe, the one who wrote the commission, he went away and came back with the Pitt Commission 10 chapters more or less in place based on our observations of the problems that existed here in our island home, but the rest of the commission was testing each one of those observations. People came to give evidence, to give their point of view, and that amended whatever Professor Benton had put down in the beginning. I think I have run through the outline and timeline provided. I end this portion with an observation. It is an observation made by Sir David Gibbons. And he says, "It is our view that there is an explosive material in Bermuda's social structure and that it has not been dissipated since December. Irritations of a kind which it is impossible to predict could well act upon the stresses and strains to make them dangerous once again." Fast forward to the time now. I am PLP through and through. Cut me and I bleed green. But there is no guarantee in the Progressive Labor Party government, as there was no guarantee in the United Unity Party government, as there was no guarantee in the OBA, that if the public we serve are not served well, then at any given time, the ills that we addressed in the Pitt Commission could reoccur. We are only going to remain safe and sound and productive, fruitful, and in actual fact, a democratic community if we all remain vigilant. But I'll make comments about that later on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. As we prepare to introduce our next speaker, we want to remind those here, and of course we have an audience with Bernews, we have an audience live with TNN, and of course the entire proceedings are being taped by CITV. This Heritage Month Forum is under the auspices of the Ministry of Labour, Community Affairs and Sports, the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs. Next up, Rolf Commission, JPMP. Rolf has spent most of his political career fighting to advance the issues of social, economic, and racial justice for Bermudians. He first gained some notice during the early 1990s as a community and political activist, and as a columnist, featured regularly in publications such as the Bermuda Times, the Bermuda Sun, and the Royal Gazette. He went on to serve as a consultant to two premiers of Bermuda, the Honourable Ewart Brown and the Honourable Paula Cox, from 2010 to 2011. While at the Cabinet Office, in addition to his work as a policy analyst, he was program director of the government's The Big Conversation. He also facilitated the pioneering work conducted by Professor Ronald Mincy and his team in their comparative study of young black males that was known as the Mincy Report. In 2012, Ralph was elected to the House of Assembly representing Pembroke Southeast. As chairman, he led the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee that resulted in placing the living wage firmly on the government's agenda for legislative implementation in 2019. Ralph Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. I just want to say firstly that I've been very gratified to be here amongst the 16 panel. To hear the presentation by Ms. Ferbert, I thought it was very profound, and of course, Mr. Barrett, and especially Mr. Scott, who was a member of that set of commissioners. He would also remember that there was one individual who was slated to appear before the commission to offer testimony, and that person never showed up. Mea culpa. It was me. And I'll try to make up for it tonight. Sister Laverne, 30 minutes. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Sister Laverne had read an excerpt from the Commission's final report. It ran as follows. It says, black people were expected to know their place and be thankful for favors. The Bermudian pattern resembled that of the southern states of the United States. And I'm just going to add this with, of course, one exception. They never lynched us. So that was the difference, right? Okay. I just want to say that we have Ms. Cheryl Griffin in the house, and she had a very brilliant critical analysis of the nexus, the intersection between race and education in Bermuda. And still talked about how white privilege is still encoded within education, the whole structure of it, public and private, and how I'm going to make the case that it's still encoded within Bermuda at large. So let's start here, because I believe that the past is prologue, and that it powerfully informs the present. We do know that after World War II, the British Empire, on its knees, had to make some significant changes how it was going to operate that empire, whether it would begin the process of divesting itself of much of that empire. You couldn't fight a war against Nazi Germany, which had institutionalized white supremacy, largely focused in terms of their historical animus against the Jews, be successful in fighting that war upon the basis of things like democracy, but yet maintain a racial hierarchical oppressive regime within your own empire. It was untenable, in other words, after 1945. And so you had various moves on the part of many within these territories for self-determination. Universal adult suffrage was one of the biggest principles that were fought for, because how else within that system could they then begin to exercise that self-determination? So throughout the Caribbean region, of which I'm going to say we were a part and still remain somewhat a part of, two things occurred post-1945. Firstly, through most of these English-speaking territories, colonies, firstly, by way after universal adult suffrage had been achieved, you had usually the election of black majority governments. Jamaica, Trinidad, some of the bigger islands. That was largely followed within a year, year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, toward full independence. That was the pattern. And that pattern persisted probably between the late 1950s, when you would have had universal adult suffrage, allowing that process to begin, black majority governments first, and then independence following that, right up until the early 1980s. I remember today my grandmother and a few of her friends going down to St. Kitts, people like the Henrys and others. They had some St. Kitts and Nevesian ancestry, and my grandmother and that whole crowd, about 7 or 8 of them, going down to St. Kitts and Nevis on the occasion of St. Kitts and Nevis's independence. And they were so excited. So that would have been sort of the last round of that cycle. The thing that the white elite in Bermuda were trying to avoid was that outcome in the post-World War II era. How were they going to be able to navigate the winds of change, to paraphrase a noted British Prime Minister, in his relation to this emerging democratic wave, and be able to ride that wave while maintaining their dominance of Bermuda politically, economically, and culturally? That was what this was all about. And so moving into the 60s, concerted efforts were made to again ride that change, allow for a mutation of a system that was more blatant in its racism, more blatant in the expression of white supremacist ideology, and sort of mutate that or to just push that in a way that was going to serve their interests in what I would call this new postmodern environment, post-1960s. And so I contend that what took place by the 1977 riots was still a byproduct of that, because they had managed to actually ride that wave fairly successfully. You didn't get a black majority governor in Bermuda until 1998. And in all due respect, everybody knows, like Mr. Scott, he's been bleeding PLP green longer than me. I was born into the PLP. I bleed PLP green too. But if the fact that the PLP, and I would say the black majority, had a black majority government by 1998, it's not necessarily, I mean, we all view it as a great achievement, but to be honest, it was somewhat of an embarrassment. It came very late in the cycle, so much out of the cycle. And largely because, and even today, we're still living in the house that Sir Henry Tucker built. We are. Look around us. Look at the features of this. So when we talk about the house that Sir Henry Tucker built, what was that house and how did it look like? I'm not going to be able to tell you all the contours and all the rooms in that house, but it was usually one that sort of, in order to build a de facto majority that allows white Bermudians to maintain the electoral dominance, they had to make a shift. The property vote was gone, so they had to do things differently. One of those things was they needed allies. So then you would see the Portuguese, who were looked down on from an ethnic and probably even religious basis, are elevated and given proper white status. So-called conservative blacks are recruited, they're enticed. The system of Bermuda's patronage, white patronage, because they dominate the economy, is put into full force in order to bring them on board. Because remember, with the fact that you had gerrymandered constituency boundaries, the fact that Bermuda's white population being around at that time, even in the 60s, I think 35 to 40%, Mr. Barrett could tell me different, you only needed about 15% of black, 15 to 20% of black Bermudians to vote for the United Bermuda Party to translate that into a de facto majority. But even that was not enough. That's why you then would have had moves on part of, in terms of immigration, to cook the books there as well. So Walton Brown talks about how during that one period from 1960 to 1970, you had immigration go up by 66%. 85% of those people were white, and a high percentage of those people were of British descent. Why was that important and key? And probably to a lesser extent from Canada, because then under the rules established then, after 3 years residency, they could vote. So you have the fact that you have this whole ecosystem being created to achieve their goal to ride that wave while maintaining their dominance. So white privilege, when we talk about that, it's not just in terms of our economy, it's deeply encoded in our Constitution and in our politics today. That's the reality that led to 1968, firstly. And as an 11-year-old coming from Spanish Point with my mates, I think after the second or third day, we all left out Key West, out by Admiralty House where we grew up and born, most of us. And we walked all down to town, through Brooklyn, and came out through here And I always remember the place was burning, super safe, and my mama worked. Oh, my God. She wasn't going to go work the next day. The thing about it is, a lot of our parents turned a blind eye because they were just thoroughly fed up. I mean, I was only 11 years old. When I got tired, so some of my schoolmates were 11, 10, 12, 9. We were with the older boys. They looked out for us. The last thing I remember of that night was us quickly getting out of Dodge, meaning Court Street, right across from Annans, because that's when the tear gas came. So the pastor's prologue narrative leads me to say, yeah, whatever took place, as I've described it during that period of the post-World War II era, that 50s, 60s period, led directly to what happened in 1968, and I contend, because it's so encoded in Bermuda and still today, led to what occurred in the 1970s as well. And it was all designed to ensure that, one, you would not have black majority government in Bermuda, and secondly, certainly you would not have independence. That's why we became so much an exception out of that cycle, in my view. Lastly, independence. As you notice, the commissioners, and I must say, by the standards of that day and even now, that was the ground zero recommendation out of that commission, independence. And the rationale they gave, and you'll still hear critics saying, yeah, all you're talking about is national pride. What's that? Boo-hoo. Who cares about national pride? But they recognized that there was a lack of national identity and national pride in the country, and independence could be that framework by which we could begin to develop a new national identity comprised of Anglo-Saxon whites, black Bermudians, and persons of Portuguese descent. But we all know who always provided the veto for moving in that direction. Again, white privilege is encoded even politically in Bermuda and has been. So these are still the outstanding issues that we're still grappling with, that we must come to terms with. I'm 62 now. Imagine if we were in cycle a new Bermuda beginning circa 1980, for example, when I'm 19, 20. Meredith, the brilliant writer she is probably around the same age. Eva Hudson's only 40 years old. That's when a new Bermuda should have happened. That would have placed us right in the cycle with some of the smaller islands in the Caribbean, who again, black majority government, and maybe took a little longer, but then independence. So anyway, I just want to thank you. I'll leave it there. I'm prepared to answer any questions you may have, but
Not right now.
I hope I made some small contribution. Thank you so much.
Ralph Commission. We will, as our evening progresses, ask the panelists, especially when we get into the question and answer period, to continue to link our discussion with a Pitt report, how it lines up with it, and in the wake of, it'll help us in this perspective. Yep. Next, Cordell Riley. Cordell W. Riley, JP. Cordell has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science. Cordell is the Institutional and Research Coordinator for the Bermuda College, a position he has held since June 2014. Prior to that, Cordell was the Managing Director of Profiles of Bermuda, a company he founded in 1998. The firm conducts human resource assessments, training and development, as well as market, business, and tourism research. We used Cordell quite a bit when I was in Bermuda Broadcasting. Previously, a government statistician, Cordell has authored numerous articles in social statistics, tourism, and racial justice, and has spoken at a number of local and international conferences. Formerly the president of Citizens Uprooting Racism in Bermuda, CURB. He now holds the position of vice president. Cordell has an active interest in social and restorative justice, and in 2012 received an international diploma in restorative justice from Queen's University School of Religion. In January of 2016, Cordell was certified with the Insight Prison Project in Victim-Offender Dialogue, which enables him to conduct delicate conversations involving victims and perpetrators of violent crimes. He applies these skills at the Westgate Correctional Facility, where he currently teaches life skills. Cordell Riley.
Good evening, and I want to thank the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs for inviting me here tonight. It just dawned upon me that I am the only one on the panel not to have held political office. I wonder if that allows me to speak unvarnishedly. No disrespect to my fellow panelists. In 1977, I was an early teen. My recollections of those riots were from television. In particular, where a broadcaster who will remain nameless was running from some Molotov cocktails being thrown because the situation had gotten very, very serious. It's 1977. December 2nd. As it was already alluded to or mentioned by Laverne Furbert, that day was infamous for another reason. That 39 years to that date, as she mentioned, some of the very same protesters were at the House of Assembly trying to prevent the sale of Bermuda's only airport for 30 pieces of silver, betraying the 75% of voters who did not want that deal to go through. Some of them thought that their protesting days were over and had to come out in their elderly capacity, still fighting for something that, as other panelists have mentioned, the same things 40 and 50 years previously. Because it's very difficult, and it was certainly very painful for me to have to reread this report. Because if the question is asked, how far have we come? If we're honest, we might say economically we've come some way. But have we made actually real progress? The Pitt report made reference often to the Wooding report, and I would rank the Wooding report up there with the Pitt report in terms of its description of what happened during those periods. You can read those reports and get a sense of actually being there. The Wooding Commission, as was referenced in the Pitt report, saw an urgent need for a new and true understanding, a deep conviction of the essentiality of building a single community, providing common opportunities for all, and an unyielding commitment to promote democratic values of equality and fraternity in a society that is free in every respect. 50 years ago, that was written. And we're still trying to build a single community. In fact, the 2017 election was fought on two Bermudas. And as the Honorable John Barrett pointed out, two Bermudas was the theme that was throughout this report. And the recommendations were such that if you do these things, you would not have two Bermudas. And so, as has already been stated, they went for the low-hanging fruit. Let's give them a Small Business Development Corporation. let's give them a Bermuda Day to celebrate. But the welfare tax, oh, we can't do that. Leave that one alone. That's going to touch me where it hurts. The report was painful for Tamiri to read because it just reminded me of how little progress has been made on the economic front. This whole thing that comes up today, inequality. In fact, when Jonathan Smith asked me to write the last chapter in his book, Island Flames, I looked at the statistics, and in fact, the gaps between whites and black economically is getting wider and wider. So how far have we progressed? When Lord Ammett was here and Kerb was invited to meet with him, along with others in the social justice field, we pointed out, as was pointed out in the report, that Bermuda was still having its racial challenges. That if you wanted to change it, you had to start with the governor on down. You can't have the highest office in the land bringing in folk from overseas to hold top positions and then expect others to do otherwise. Because if you look out through Bermuda, in schools, boardrooms, neighborhoods, how much have they changed? How much have they really changed? In the report, it said that many whites believe that we have made tremendous progress, and that people like Dr. Eva Hudson, people like Ralph Commission, people like myself should moderate our demands. You have enough. What more do you want? Reminds me of Martin Luther King. How long, sir? Not long. Not long. The report states that white people rarely understand how deep the wounds of discrimination can strike into an individual's personality. Racial trauma. Dr. Joy DeGruy called it post-traumatic slave syndrome. It's in our psyche. And so you hear folks saying they're playing the race card. They're always talking about race. But that was the foundation upon which this country was built. There was a passage in the report that said the premier told the commission that he was totally dedicated to building an integrated society. But they joked that they hadn't quite worked out what that meant. And so we had the 68 disturbances. We had the 77 disturbances. And a witness to the commission, and I'm sure the Honorable Alex Scott probably recalls him, he said to the commission that we need to have a riot every now and then for government to get things done. Martin Luther King stated that violence is the voice of the unheard. So the simple solution is to listen. And once you have listened, act. So how far have we come in those 40-odd years since the report was written? Racially and economically, probably not that far. One of the solutions to that in the Commission's findings was that, and I'll read it, the Commission endorsed independence as a solution to the divide, and I assume to building that totally integrated society. Well, how much do you hear of independence today? I remember having a conversation with a friend from Barbados, and we were talking about independence. And they said, I don't know what you're all having this debate about. In Barbados, the government said when they won, we're going independent. The next thing I knew, they're putting up a flag. It wasn't, oh, we got to do this, and we got to prepare for it. It was the natural progression. So I wonder sometimes if we are afraid to do that which we ought to do. And if so, why? You see, it's one thing to brag that we've got 2511. It's yet another to govern as if it's 1917. Let me give you an example, and I'll finish on this. The other night, I was at a forum where the Minister of National Security was speaking. And he was discussing the progress made on the Canadian biometrics demand, if I can put it that way. Where now that if you're going to school or work in Canada, you need to have biometrics done. And you have to fly to New York to get them. You can't get them done in Bermuda, and you can't get them done in Canada. So I raised my hand. Colleague calls me her rebel. But I just asked questions. Isn't that right? I said, Minister, what about a diplomatic solution? I said, why not request those Canadians who have to work in Bermuda to go to that same New York biometric clinic and get theirs done before coming here? And the response is, we can't play our best hand first. But my response was, if you played that hand, there would be no need to play another hand. And so, 40 years, 50 years after the Wooding Report, 40 years or so after the Pitt Report, I'm appearing on the panel discussing a living wage. When most Western countries are discussing how much more we have to take it up. And so, if we have, or if we want to make progress, we have to exercise courageously the power that is given so that we can improve the lives of our people and, Eugene Johnson, unapologetically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just to remind our viewers and those here, we are taking a look at the Pitt Report, some 41 years on. How far have we come? Before we go into the Q&A, and Yes, we will move into our last speaker on the panel, Mr. Parentchief. Phil Parentchief is a former Barclayite with a degree in political economy and a master's in economics and law. He attended Osgoode Hall Law School at York University, Dalhousie University, Tulane University, the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Leiden University in the Netherlands, and the University of Malta, where he studied diplomatic affairs and international relations. A former teacher, Mr. Parentchief joined the PLP in 1967. He has run as a candidate for the PLP and intermittently as an independent. He is the former Attorney General of Bermuda and Minister for Legal Affairs. Mr. Parentchief also worked for 7 years in the AG's chambers as one of their legal counsels. Mr. Parentchief was a member of the Black Beret cadre and has been well in tune, as he says, with Bermuda's social and political environment. Phil Parentchief.
Good evening, everyone. I don't know if it's enviable or not to be the last speaker. I've just leafed through my presentation, and I've seen that at least 40% of it has been heard already. But I'm going to try to nevertheless work through it and present what I believe should be the emphasis here. I think I should also briefly mention that my public activism in Bermuda began when I was 25 years old. In fact, on December 31st, 1969, Ewart Brown and I took over the City Hall steps, and we rang in what we said was the decade of change. That was around 3 o'clock that day. Around 3:30, Commissioner Dockett appeared with some 200 officers to shut us down. That event was being attended, even in that short half hour, by a few hundred people. And we put the question to the people whether or not they wanted us to shut down that meeting. There was a resounding no, and we stood our ground and continued until roughly 5:30. At that rally, or that meeting, we discussed every topic under the Pitt report. 9 years before the Pitt report. Ewart's a few years younger than I am, 23, 24 at the time. And we took the position that we were going to dedicate our lives to pushing through social, political, and economic change in this country. I won't go into it, but you can see that it comes with a price. But that's a price we're prepared to pay. Because I've used some of the time to make that introduction, I'm going to stick fairly closely to my script. Mr. Moderator, thank you. And so that we can stay on track. But I want to commend the other speakers for covering extremely well the points that they have elucidated this evening. I agree with them. In very fundamental ways, we have at best remained the same or worse, even going backwards from where we were in 1978. I vividly remember the 1968 disturbances, and more vividly remember the 1977 disturbances. I well remember Buck and Larry, comrades, both of them. Progress cannot be measured solely by materialism and technological advancements without more. Unfortunately, we have lost our way. We've abandoned our mission as a people and as a nation to achieve true democracy, equality, freedom, and self-determination. As a result, we wallow in confusion in an environment essentially not made with, for, or by us, and certainly not on a power-sharing or decision-making basis. He who fundamentally controls and directs any given society, economically, commercially, and educationally, ultimately controls that society politically, socially, and internationally. What, I ask, has really changed 41 years after the Pitt report? To be clear and frank about the matter, what in relative terms between the races in Bermuda today has substantively and substantially changed economically, commercially, and socially since 1620, in fact? Take, for instance, a good, hard, and long look at Dockyard, Hamilton, Flats Village, and St. George's Town, and ask yourselves, who really controls and largely benefits economically and commercially from these venues 41 years after the Pitt report? The economic elite is relatively a small percentage of the population, who continue to this day to own and control well over 90% of the wealth of this society. What has really changed since 1978? This result must be directly attributed to the 1620 trickle-down economic and financial systems based on retrograde and outdated taxation and monetary policies. Policies put in place by the ruling elite for the ruling elite from the very inception of this country. These regressive public administration systems generationally perpetuate the inequalities and the maldistribution of the wealth of this community that we witness today. Accordingly, unless and until we honestly and completely uproot and not just simply tinker with these Stone Age systems of maldistribution of wealth, we are going to, in varying degrees, in breadth and depth, continue to experience the economic and social injustices and the violence that goes with it that we suffer today. Interestingly, this key public initiative, public policy initiative, was picked up in clause, take the note, the reference, 1.7, chapter 1, page 1 of the Pitt report. Allow me to partially quote, Mr. Moderator. In 1946, the Bermuda Workers Association prepared a petition to the Secretary of State for the Colonies requesting the appointment of a royal commission to investigate and report on the social, economic, and political conditions of Bermuda, with recommendations for the alleviation of the inequities under which the black population was suffering. The Secretary of State requested the Bermuda Colonial Parliament to consider the petition, drawing to their attention social matters which he thought required action, and in particular one, namely the introduction of direct taxation, picked up by Mr. Barrett earlier, where radical reform was needed. Not required, but needed. Mr. Zool, a Bermudian historian, commented that the petition and the idea of direct taxing of the profits of the corporate and professional elite fell flat. Changes were still many years away. It was turned down flatly. So you may now understand why I made the comment that we have stood still and perhaps even gone backwards. On a parting note, I think it would be remiss if I didn't highlight or comment on the 1978 Pitt report and its views on independence or self-determination. Yes, I bleed green, but I also bleed freedom. I will always push for self-determination and independence. It's interesting because this report touches upon the fundamental plank of the PLP's original 1963 Constitution. I joined this party primarily as a result of what I saw in that Constitution. In early 1967, I joined when I was 23 years of age. As an early member, 4 years after its inception. At page 36 of chapter 12, at clauses 12.12 and 12.13 of this report, inclusively, the Pitt report reported and recommended thusly. This leads us inexorably to the discussion of independence and to the question of whether those who are presently alienated from the social order would identify themselves more effectively with an independent Bermuda. We believe that there is a sufficient likelihood of this for it to constitute a principal argument for accelerated constitutional change. We recognize that whereas many black Bermudians see independence as the final step in a process of emancipation, this argument has little appeal to white Bermudians, for they see themselves as already emancipated. This commission went on to say particularly, and again, with immigration policy in mind, and it was expanded upon or touched upon by Mr. Barrett, this commission had this to say: the planning of social integration will have to be based upon a shared concept of Bermudian nationhood. That concept can only become a reality when Bermuda comes of age and the country takes to its rightful position in the international community as a fully independent nation. Only then can Bermuda demonstrate her political maturity to the world at large. I seriously ask, have we really, really progressed since 1978? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Mr. Parenti. So in just a moment, we will view a very short video clip, about a minute and a half, and then we will go into a question and answer period and pick up the pace a bit. So those of you who are around my age, and our generation saw it as the best of times and the worst of times. Yeah, we lived through a period of unprecedented violence. I'm not talking about the violence we see right now. Unprecedented. We had a commissioner murdered. We had a governor and ADC murdered. Fast forward, we had supermarket managers murdered. 2 persons arrested in the ensuing years, ultimately convicted of capital murder. Both men were sent to the gallows in '77, sparking the most tumultuous time in recent history. That's why we're talking about the Pitt report, 41 years on. In the wake of that unrest, for those watching of a different generation, came the Royal Commission, headed up, as you've heard, by Lord Pitt. And thus our discussion tonight. Interesting, they tell us that in order to correct the problem, we first got to say we have a problem, identify it, and what have we. Some of us in media used to ask, do we have the political will? I want to show a short clip, if we can hit the lights, and how did the government of the day describe the events? Very short, and then we'll go into our Q&A. Yes. Yes. You would? You run it? Easy.
Mr. Gibbons, would you say that the events of the past few days were totally as a result of the executions, or could they have been, the executions have been the straw that broke the camel's back?
I think that would be almost impossible to identify. At any given point in time, there is in any community a group of people that just do enjoy raising a mayhem, and certainly the emotional appeal in such a situation could understandably have triggered it. But to what extent that that was a straw, I couldn't say.
And you feel it is confined totally to just a few, 400 or 500 young persons under the age of 24?
Well,
the rest of the black community are definitely absolutely anti the whole business.
Well, perhaps the other one, perhaps John Swan, for police, would give a better assessment.
Well, I think that to say that the whole community is against what appears to be a group of young people, what they're doing, I think would be a wrong assessment. I think that there have been some statements that have been made that have tended to be inflammatory. And these statements have tended to sort of, in the minds of a lot of the young people, been indications to them that they should do something. I think there have been some very irresponsible acts committed by some, what we consider to be some responsible people in our community.
By whom?
Now, that by whom is for the next piece. We're looking to do a broader piece on that. But we'll take it on from here, if you will hit the lights back on. Again, that's very raw, uncut from the Richardson file, but it was a reflection of the government of the day. And so we arrive at this point, and we are reflecting 41 years on. I'd like to start by asking the Honorable Alex Scott. You were on the commission. What do you feel was the most significant recommendation untouched, wasn't tackled, and why aren't we tackling that today?
It's very easy. The most significant recommendation was the last recommendation, and that is for Bermuda to seriously consider and begin to prepare for sovereignty, independence, self-determination, for all the reasons that have been given this evening, and all the reasons that have been shared with the public over the years. And it's one of the reasons, if not the reason, that on assuming the position of Premier, within a year, we began the process of preparing, educating Bermudians about moving to sovereignty.
Are we any closer?
No.
Follow-up comment, reaction, Rolf.
Well, Rick, I just want to say that I've got to spend some time at your house so I can go into your archives. That was brilliant, especially in light of the comments I made a few weeks ago with respect to Sir John Swan's role politically. If anything sort of symbolized powerfully what I taught about the encoding of white privilege within our constitution and political realities. It was that. So here you have David Gibbons, flanked by two black men to insulate him, to give him cover for what they were doing. And then the black spokesperson actually says what most of the white supporters that supported that party wanted to hear, that it's just a few malcontents. In other words, to delegitimate the causation, the cause that was motivating black Bermudians in the main to take the actions that they took. And that's always been the history here. So that clip was very illustrative of that. And once again, I want to thank you for providing it.
Phil.
I don't think I could articulate it any better than Rolf. It is always the case that when an answer becomes uncomfortable for many of the white leaders, that they would look to their assistance, any assistance in that matter, from the very people who they are, in coded language, criticizing. This would have been, I guess, a meeting after the 1977. I was introduced as being a member of the Black Beret cadre. That is true. I was a very proud, and still am, a very proud member of the Black Beret cadre. One day that story is going to be told because there's a gap. Many of us, in fact, were always supportive of the PLP. In fact, we were youth wing members, many of us, in pushing forward what we thought was an agenda that was not being pushed fast enough by the mainstream PLP. I don't want to at this point go into the makeup of that group, but I can say that seeing the clip that you have very graciously given us, it was a kind of motivation when we see black men in particular allowing themselves to be used in that fashion. It makes it difficult for us when we see that the same black person who's been put in that position has been also made a national hero. Well, I frankly say that that might be so, but for many reasons that I won't discuss here, there's no national hero of mine.
Cordell.
That clip in the Pitt report, Sir David Gibbons was asked a question. There are people appealing to him to delay the execution. And they said, wouldn't it heal the community if you delayed or stayed the execution? And his response was quite ironic. No, on the contrary, if I delayed it, it will cause the community to have further divide. That clip characterized the level of thinking and how far it was removed from the general population of Bermuda.
Ralph? No. Ralph, you just commented. I need to come back. I need to hear across. Anyone else want to speak on that?
Rick, in one sense, I'm reluctant to do it because I neither want to be an apologist nor someone who explains what occurred and what was in people's minds those many years ago. Hindsight, ladies and gentlemen, is 20/20 vision when we look back. The question you first asked that Alex answered was, what was the leading or the most important change recommendation of the Pitt report? And he lighted upon it because, to my way of thinking, it was where they led to that as a conclusion. having looked at the broad landscape of Bermuda and our difficulties and our challenges and the fact that we were two peoples apart, underlying everything we do, and there are reasons for that. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And then you look at an issue like independence. It has been brought forward since then on a number of occasions. The first time was by the United Bermuda Party under Sir John Swan, when it was, my words now, sprung on the population of Bermuda at that time because it had never been part of the UBP manifesto, which caused division in the United Bermuda Party. And I was part of that division, I have to tell you. And it was put to a referendum. It became caught up in politicking at the time, and it was defeated. And the problem with independence is you can't seem to get a majority to support it every time there's a poll. When Alex tried with the commission to resurrect it and bring it forward, Alex, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the hot potato was dropped. It went into the night again. It never materialized. Because part of the problem is that as a people, as Bermudians, black and white, we still have this problem. We have this gap that is economic, social, cultural, and political. Tell me one I've missed. Even some people argue in sport today. Would you think that would be a unifying factor? We've got this problem. And to get us to unite around something like independence, a majority isn't, as I see it, buying it, because they know we've got greater problems. You know, we talked about immigration and the economy. One of the interesting things, I meant to mention this, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get carried away here, that the commission, the Pitt report said, look, with respect to your problems in economic growth, you know, you should enter the third stage now, one of low growth, high wages, and low immigration, and you ought to set your sights lower. Well, that never happened. I mean, that was anathema back in that day, and the United Bermuda Party, being a business-oriented party, figured the best way to move Bermuda forward was economically, and that was always the focus. And while the Pitt report tackled our problems that we were facing in tourism, there was a new wave coming. It only just started then, and that was international business, reinsurance and insurance. And these were the things that propelled Bermuda forward economically. We can decry materialism, but Bermudians, by and large, in my estimation, are pragmatic people. There's the old expression, they vote by their pocketbook, and we're not unique in that respect. But that has to I think that has to be recognized to a large extent as being one of the forces at play post 1977, notwithstanding our challenges, and as a result of which we glossed over or ignored problems that the commission identified that continue to fester to this day.
Just before I go back to Phil Parent-Chief, and then we'll do another round, I want you to hold on to something and give this some thought. Bermuda, then and now, is reluctant to tell things as it is. My opinion. Reluctant to tell things as it is. We, to an extent, even with our level of violence today, we are very careful to protect our economy by saying, as a journalist, I was told, let's not do that story, not internally, but externally, because we might reflect something badly on Bermuda. If we are, in my opinion, to tackle these problems, we have to say right up front what's happening, acknowledge the problems, and tackle. Once Phil has a comment, I'd like for us to look at that. Yes, Phil?
Thank you very much, Ms. Monroe.
He keeps
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Just as a note.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
The engineer keeps the mics off as to avoid feedback, and some of them And so give it a pause, and then he's quick with the draw, but he needs a little more time.
It's
You're on.
good. It's good. Thank you very much. Just a reply to Mr. Barrett, actually. On the issue of independence, and a few others, but I'm certainly going to focus on independence in the 2 minutes I have, I think, on this one. Many of us, but I certainly was, when I came up, there were 3 no's in my vocabulary, 3 negatives. There was to be no PLP government. There was to be no corporate or direct taxation. And there was to be no independence. All of those initiatives were being sown in the society in order to socialize and brainwash us at large on matters that we did not have a great understanding about. Having said that, and having been brainwashed in that way, we who believe we are more enlightened and understand these things have a duty to unravel these myths. Now, on the independence in 1995, the referendum, there were many negatives that abounded. There was the abstention vote by the PLP because matters got caught up in politics, whether or not it should be by referendum or by general election, or whether independence should be brought in by the PLP or the UBP and what have you. I won't go into my role at that, but I was a broker in that process. But even the structuring of the voting, it was a mathematical formula, even in the voting, that I believe at least 40% of the electorate on the roll would have to show up in order to reach the first threshold, and then a majority vote thereafter. So there are many things in play against it, and I just want to take those few minutes to put it into context and to note that we had, I believe, experienced a very severe storm physically just a few days before. And I actually, at that time, rushed to court in order to challenge the fact that some ballot boxes were not opened, some people didn't get a chance to vote, and under the then Parliamentary Election Act, I believe it was Section 27, but what should have happened was that Parliament ought to have been reconvened and this referendum held at a more propitious time. But thank you, Mr. Moderator. Let's see it in context, please.
Indeed. Mr. Scott, you were looking to speak to something earlier.
Bermuda, the establishment, have put tremendous energy into resisting change, progress, and independence. Otto Simmons, Sr., asks that I had an advertising agency.
Indeed.
Take unto us a talented young man who wanted to be an artist, his son. He used to come by the agency after school. And one day he arrived, and so did Bill Black and another special branch agent. I had been in the dark room. The secretary called me across to tell me that these men were interrogating young Art. I came in, told them, number one, he is working with us. He is underage. I am the one you should be talking to. I don't have anything to say to you, and we showed them the door. Within 2-3 weeks, I went to a Central Committee meeting. Fred Wade came to me and said, I'd like to introduce you to this fellow who has something to show to you. And he showed me a piece of 2x4. I said, it's just a piece of wood. He said, no, open it up. And I broke it apart. And in it, it had a little transistor. The transistor had been found by this workman in the ceiling of our office. The transistor would send the signal, it was just strong enough to send the signal outside to a larger transistor, and then it went elsewhere. I know who it was because once I got involved in politics and PLP, when you called our office, a tape would start rolling. And one day, we found the police on the line. This has all been documented. I played it in the Senate. And they said it was a cross line. Well, I agree with them. Fast forward, until then, I had been behind the scenes, consultant to the PLP. You didn't see me. But now we were coming to the fore. Fast forward, I'm premier. We set up BIC, Bermuda's Independent Commission, put a broad cross-section of Bermudians on that commission. They took evidence here, they researched elsewhere, and the one thing, Dame Lois was a consultant to them, Ralph was a member, we had accountants who were members, Michael Winfield was a member, Bermuda was made up that committee. And wherever they went, one thing they would come back with, no country is more prepared to go independent than Bermuda. We published the report, it was solid, and the Royal Gazette did its work. It pulled out one line. We said that no country had gone, the report said, no country had gone independent by referendum. There was one exception, and that was an exception. It was, what? I want to say Vanuatu, but I'm not sure. But what happened in that particular country is that they took the decision to go independent by a vote, the way that we wanted to do it. But to ratify it, they had a referendum, meaning the people decided they want to go independent, and to confirm it, they had a referendum. So they they initially decided to go by virtue of the vote. That story and Bermudans conservatism took the momentum right out of the momentum we were building. And I can go on time after time, effort after effort, showing how the powers that be are the powers that still have the authority. The black community, the PLP, have politics in one hand, and the economy is in another hand. And until we can either bring them together, or we can take over, and I'm not talking black, I'm talking the authority of the people of Bermuda, because the government of the day was put there by the people of Bermuda. And until they can move forward in an unfettered way, we will always be running into the conservatism, that is holding Bermuda back on the heading of it's in your best interest to not change. And we will have to change if we ever want to really be free. Any parliament that answers to another parliament, that people are not free. And so we may feel that we are in charge here, not yet.
Indeed. So we've heard in that area some profound statements. We want to come back and revisit some of those things, but the Commission also looked at things like education. Are we any further on in resolving our education problems? Where are we there? Did we ever get close to it? Rolf.
Well, again, if you look at Bermuda's education system and its evolution, again, it reflects the encoding of white privilege in Bermuda in the postmodern era. Those schools that we call private schools, even I sometimes refer to them as historically white private schools, they weren't historically white private schools. They were government-aided schools like Berkeley.
So listen, are we any further on?
Hey, can I finish my statement? Thank you.
I heard that statement earlier on.
No, you didn't hear that
So
one. No,
now, no, listen, hold on.
Okay.
Now, time,
I'm going to get
it's getting a bit late, so I'll have to ask you, I'll have to ask you to keep focused so that we can stay focused.
Okay.
And
So these,
take a look at that.
Yeah, these schools were not private schools. They were government-aided schools. So when you had the democratization of Bermuda, whites refused to have their kids in schools that would have been black majority. So then they privatized the schools, just as they did in the American South. So that goes, and that's what some of the things that Sister Cheryl Griffin wrote about in her brilliant piece only last week. So that's part of the problem, ongoing problem, that we have with education.
Is that preventing us from improving our system, our public system? Yes. Yes. Listen, let me say this. Let me say this to our audience also, and for the sake of Sister Laverne. Feel free at this stage to jump in so that we keep it flowing and we have this interaction. We have a mic here. No long statement site. You come to the mic, I didn't say now, but when you come to the mic and you have a question, and if it's a comment, I'd ask you to keep it short, yeah? So that's all. Laverne.
Okay, as far as our education system is concerned, there was at one point when we had the Berkeley Institute before Cedar Ridge Academy. I would think that Bermuda had an excellent education system. Bermuda graduated many people from the Berkeley Institute that went on to be leaders of industry, et cetera, in Bermuda. But then came along this school of thought or whatever that told people, you don't want to send your children to Berkeley. You want to send your children to Warwick Academy or send your children to Salters because they have a better education. So what did it mean? It's our public education system that is suffering. Why? Because we don't get the brightest and the best anymore.
Okay, some comments. Again to the panel, feel free to jump in at this stage. Laverne, anything else?
Not for now.
All right, good stuff. Anyone in the audience, we have the mic, come forward, you can do that, and then feel free to jump in, guys, when we come back. And lady. Yes.
I just want to ask a brief question. We are talking about the Pitt report then, and has there been any difference now? We have a lot of brilliant young minds that are in our community, young men and women today. Why ain't there one or two on this panel to give their perspective?
All right.
We have a lot of young, brilliant minds in our community today, young man or female. Why are their views why are they not on the panel to give their views?
So let me...
Despite them not even being around back then.
Let me offer a recommendation as we move forward. I was out and about at the time. Mr. Scott has just refreshed my memory, brought me up to speed. And I think this discussion is going to bring us up to speed, and then we can build on it. We have to start somewhere, and I see this as a start. Not to say it could not be on. That's one of the reasons we started with the Leader of Youth Parliament. We started with the Leader of Youth Parliament to tell us, what do the young people want? What kind of Bermuda do they want? And I thought she was quite articulate in presenting those ideas. But for community and cultural, I'm sure this excellent forum, they will look to build on it. We have someone else from the floor, and then I'd like the Phil Parent, Chief, you'll go from here. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Maxine Estelle. I've been an educator for, even though I'm retired, I'm still an educator, but I've been an educator for over 40 years. When someone mentioned about are we preparing our community, our young people for independence, we have to have a resounding no. Because you can't tell people that they can be independent if you don't tell them that they can educate themselves. We as a system have decided that we have to have permission to be intelligent from somewhere else. We have to have permission to be called an intelligent populace because we're going to do GCEs from another country which has another culture, has another system entirely, but we have to let them tell us whether we're intelligent people or not. Bermuda, when the commission spoke about education, it talked about providing GCE reports and et cetera. At that point in the 70s, there was the opportunity for the Bermuda Secondary School Certificate. The Bermuda Secondary School Certificate educated and graduated young people who went on to college and university. Everybody didn't, but there's no system that has everybody that goes on to college and university. No country that has that. But we have convinced ourselves that unless we are tied to a system of education from somewhere else, then we're not smart enough to do it. I'm speaking from experience because as a person who was the Senior Education Officer for Curriculum Instruction, I remember traveling with education officers to countries all over the world where they completely were enamored by the education officers that we had in this system. That they were intelligent, that they were smart, they wished they came and taught where we were. But we as Bermudians never felt, while I was in the Ministry of Education, that we were quite good enough to educate ourselves. And if we're not good enough to educate ourselves, how can we expect our young people to feel that they can govern themselves? So we have to understand that we have to start from the beginning and recognize that we can develop a system that educates ourselves. We had the BSSC, we had the BSc, we did away with all of that in spite of the fact that we're talking about being independent because we need to go and get our education approval from somewhere else.
Thank you.
Don't fight.
Thank you. And what I'd ask the panel to simply make a few notes as they're asking the question, just so that you don't lose a trend. If there's something you've heard so far while you're getting your nourishment so we can continue this, Phil, you're not eating. You may want to comment.
Yes, I have a different food for thought. Very briefly, this education business,
yes.
When I was in high school, there were two other high schools at that time, in fact three, Howard Academies, Sands Secondary, the Technical Institute. See, my maths are not good. There were a few, but they were all excellent institutions. We were graduating people, or people were graduating from Berkeley, and they would leave and go off to the most prestigious universities around. I heard the young lady, the junior premier, make a comment that seems to rebound and resonate throughout society here in the last couple of years, i.e., we have to educate our people in order to take the higher echelons of the occupations that are now filled by foreigners. Balderdash. We have been, and still are, extremely intelligent and certificated people. We have some of the highest number of degrees, from bachelor's through to doctorates. And I can say that even from our high school level, if we really wanted to fill the spots of the foreigners in these so-called higher echelons, we could fill them, or fill quite a few of them, from our graduates right on through. I say, and I used to say a lot, that Bermuda College, 1974, was established. Here it is 45 years later, and we are still not a full degree awarding institution. That must change. And I'm going to really, for those who make a noise about it by saying we're too small, the community, et cetera, well, let me tell you, as a teacher, and I used to teach, but as a teacher and otherwise, we have students in this country who go abroad to towns where 5,000 people are. Bermuda entertains anywhere between 300,000, 400,000 people coming in. We are some of the most world-traveled people. So I don't want to hear this business about we're too small to have a university or a college that gives us a 4-year degree awarding. In fact, master's degrees. And that can be in insurance and reinsurance and the like. We just have to do that. There are many young people, Ms. Moderator, you mentioned them, who, for one reason or the other, cannot afford to go abroad, or some have married early or had children early, extremely bright, but they cannot afford and should not have to afford to relocate to another country in order to get a tertiary education. We can do that right here in this country, and it's long overdue that we have not done.
Point made.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm nervous, but I'm going to say what I want
Never
to
mind.
say. We do not have a failing public education system. We do not have a failing public. When did it become failing? At integration, when there was white flight, or at amalgamation, when there was white flight, or when there was restructuring and there was white flight. We continually compare our public education with what we have been indoctrinated to think is better. I think it's a setup. It's a setup so that when our children finish school, they come back, people can say, oh, they're not educated enough. They went to public school in Bermuda. They're not well educated enough. They could have gone to better schools. We need to start you at the bottom rather than start you at a step up. Okay? We need to think about that. What we do, what we say about our own children. Educators do not spend all day in school wasting their time. The Ministry of Education, and nobody's a big fan of the Ministry of Education, but they do not sit down there all day wasting their time. Education is ever evolving. They're always, I was a teacher for 40 years, and every single year in public school, tried to do better than the year before. You have children in the public education system who are very, very challenged, and children who are very much of high flyers, and we cater to them all. I am retired now. I still go and volunteer at the Barclay Institute. Brilliant children, brilliant, all the potential in the world, but we let people keep on telling you that they're not good enough, and they are. So it annoys me. I don't want to hear anybody say we have a failing education system anymore, public education system anymore, because we don't. We have an evolving one. We have a one that we're always going to have to work at, because the world keeps changing. So please join me. Don't let people keep on telling you that your children, because they're in public education, are not good enough. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Very, very strong message, panel. Very strong message. Just a very quick floor.
Just a short one.
Very short, and then into you, sir.
Rick, there is something referred to as the psyche of dependency. And that takes the strength and confidence of a people. I ran the country with cabinet ministers, all Bermudians. Permanent secretary, all Bermudians. The staff of the civil service and of the works and engineering when I was there, cabinet secretary, staff when I was the premier, all Bermudians. We attended RIMS, we met with the World Bank, we went to the UK, we amended what the British wanted for the small territories to do. All my advisors were Bermudians. Never did we come up short. And the point is, we doubt ourselves.
Yes.
But if only we put faith in ourselves, the whole notion of not being able to do it, or not having a good education system, not producing bright youngsters, would be put in perspective and go away. There are those who invest in making us believe we need others. We need somebody from the outside. We just need to believe in ourselves.
Quite a message. Side.
Hey, Rick, and good evening, everybody. In my left hand, first of all, let me say that I'm still grieving. We lost Shiloh, and I'm still grieving. And with it comes a lot of other things. We're trying to find out what do we do with an organization, a movement. We were into developing programs for the betterment of the community, and we, the Young Progressives, are still grieving. And I say that because we were being commissioned for the Pitt report. We took the Lord Pitt, and we had our own commission in Devil's Hole. We brought Lord Pitt and also Professor Benton into Devil's Hole, and we'll talk about that. If anybody wishes to question me about that, you can do so. In my right hand is the Pitt report, and I went to England to Lord Pitt, and he told me that if we just as we believe in the Bible, we should believe in the Pitt report, because we wrote it. He said there's a lot of things that are hiddenly said, and I didn't really understand what he meant by that, but as I read it, I understand what he meant. But in my right hand is the Pitt report, and in my left hand is the profile on the prison population, a study of inmates in Bermuda commissioned by conducted by a profile of Bermuda. And I say that because we are in a crisis. If I was the government of the country, I'll call for, you understand, what we call for, Mike, when we say that they'd be in a crisis. We have people that is living in caves. We have people that are dying every day. We have a bunch of things that's going on in our country, and we here now talking about a Pitt report 40 years after that he gave the report. We have an inmate population right now that is, I don't want to speak it like that, ready to kill people because of the fact that they're not being dealt with. Their constitutional rights are being eroded. They don't know when they're going to court. We had a judge the other day just taken and what was he? Took and made a thing of court because a lawyer is defending somebody that's been in prison longer than he was supposed to be. When you talk about brilliant minds, let's look at Charles Richardson. He came out of prison a lawyer. You know, I didn't come out of prison, but I came out. I've got to thank Mr. Lita Butterfield. I invited her here Because when we're talking about education, you need to look at care. I asked her to come to speak because I wanted to speak on that fact. We have to stop looking at things that we have not done as what can we do now to change things in Bermuda. Bermuda's in a crisis. And that's all I have to say.
All right. Thank you. Strong words. Yes? So, if any others want to do either a comment, a short comment, or a question, please come up now, because we're going to do these views from the panel and then a wrap-up and a thank you from Madam Minister. Yes.
Good evening, comrades. I'm not a great public speaker and I get nervous, so I'll keep this brief. I was living in Scotland when they announced the independence referendum in 2014. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the Radical Independence campaign to work towards independence. When they announced the independence campaign, support for independence was about 30% in Scotland, which is about the same as it is in Bermuda right now. At the time of the independence, we only lost by a few percentage points. The main difference between Scotland and Bermuda is the political will of the government to lead the challenge and the argument for independence. I can understand why nothing happened up to 98, 95 accepted. Thanks for the history there earlier. 98 to 2012, with the exception of the Bermuda Independence Commission, nothing. 2017 on, we have a massive government mandate, you could argue, 2511, for independence, but I'm not seeing the political will to argue the case. I'm just curious why that is and how we're going to change that. Thank you. Have a good night.
All right. We're asking the panel just to take some notes so that when we get through the questions, in their wrap-up, they can address those issues, and then we wrap up.
Okay.
Yes,
I'll try to be quick. Those of you who know me know I'm a talker. So my name's Deidre Lee Bean, and firstly, can I ask you guys to give a round of applause to Miss Griffin, who was my teacher, who got up here to speak about not degrading the education system. So really quickly, also I'm really excited about the evolution of the Bermuda Youth Parliament. So I was a youth parliamentarian in 2001, and it's been interesting to see how that body has kind of grown to be a lot more active and interested and just impactful in understanding how Bermuda's political system works. In one of those meetings, I believe it was Dean Jennifer Smith who, when we had expressed issues with moving into the middle school system and not understanding that and feeling like that was a bit of a trauma, she mentioned that it was kind of intentional. It was something around 2 years of academic work spread out over 3 years, which kind of always stuck with me because I kind of felt that, the changes that were happening in Bermuda's school system was kind of to slow us down, to put us in line with what was going on with the rest of Bermuda. It was my understanding that there are some times where people, like young Bermudians, were graduating at an age where they couldn't go to university yet. So that kind of was upsetting to me. And I don't necessarily feel like our public education system is failing us because there's a lot of different streams that have to be dealt with. So like I didn't have to deal with people having issues in my class because I was kind of in advanced because, I'm a nerd. But
thanks for telling us.
No problem. So my question, I think, is around the fact that I think some of the degradation that happens is because Bermuda we do look very external for our validation. We look external for to try to understand us being a success, and some of that is kind of getting in line or kind of moving towards people being accountants in international business and financial services, and not necessarily also uplifting the fact that we need people who can actually do work with their hands. Like, you can have all the money in the world, but if it's no way to build your house and fix your plumbing, your way of life is challenged. So I guess my question is if anybody wanted to give any thoughts on how we could increase the level of respect and intention on preparing people to be able to work with their hands and giving a lot more reverence to trades and have an intention in our education system on getting people involved and masters of trade before they leave. Like, I feel like a lot of the work on increasing the understanding of trades happens after we're already out of school. And it's a little bit, even like, it's kind of a throwaway when we're in middle school. I know there's DNT, but it's kind of a throwaway. It's not, or at least, I graduated 14 years ago now, so maybe in the last
right.
14 years.
We are going to have to wind you up there.
That's fine.
I'll
I'm winded up. Thank you.
Wind you up.
Yeah, handshake, because it was perfect winding up.
Marvelous. Marvelous. And I'll ask the panel to pick pieces of that and give us some comment from these questions. Okay, so we've got 2 remaining, and then we are looking to wind up. Mr. Markham.
Michael Markham here.
I just
want to ask a question. Two people on the panel, please. Both of whom I know, and I think they will give me a profound answer. First one is to Mr. Parentes, who we've dealt with a number of issues before. And I wanted to ask you opinion afterwards, a question about one of the final recommendations that was that we would have independence as a form of national unity, with all of us taking pride in being Bermudian. And as a Bermudian, I want to ask Mr. Parentes for his honest opinion about whether we could have a form of racial reconciliation and forgiveness between the races, which would allow us then to all move together forward in I don't want to say a biracial, but essentially as more unified, and some forgiveness on both sides of the coin in terms of the racial injustice. I know it's a little difficult, that 4-year-old, but in any case, I think if that happened, there would be a much more successful independence in the country.
Is that your question?
That was a question for Mr. Parents.
Your next question will have to be brief. That wasn't brief.
It wasn't brief.
No, go on, I'm sorry.
Well, it's so long, I forgot the question. And the former Premier, Alex Scott, who also knows me and my work when I was working with the Progressive Labor Party, but my last years have been with Shiloh Gershwin Smith, who we recently lost, and I was deeply involved with him. He was my neighbor and a friend, and
digressing.
And he was involved with this report and having it come together.
Your question?
I forgot.
Oh, okay.
All
right.
Down.
Kate?
Thank you. Give someone else.
Yes.
2012, like I said, I thought I knew, but tonight has served as some confirmation as to why I gave you my support in 2012. The mission has been abandoned. Yes. I heard about Mr. Tucker, and I'm still living in the house that Jack Tucker built, and what automatically strikes me is that, had the 1995 exercise not been manipulated as it had been, perhaps we wouldn't be still talking about that narrative, had it not been manipulated, right? Also, Ms. Frederick mentioned about, needing more white people, and with all due respect, I'm about humanity, and I do accept and understand some of the strongholds that still keep us bound, but I'm about humanity. And Ms. Frederick may have mentioned about needing more white folks to acknowledge, like the Lauren Bowles and the few names just mentioned. But I'm saying, no, we need more black people to accept our plight, stand up to the manipulation. You mentioned the reluctance of people, dealing with certain issues. And I'm going to say the reluctance is because it relieves people of accountability, right? Mr. Scott, you mentioned about dependency. I'm going to say, well, people that we suffer from codependency, And my question is that, I find it an insult on top of injury, that here it is 41 years later, that we would now want to discuss this report. It's an insult. And it's an insult to the black community, you understand? Some of them clips, or that clip that we saw with Mr. Swan, is the first time I'm ever seeing that. Why hasn't that been a part of our educational curriculum? Why? But good point, but who stands accountable for that? 1998 has come. And if we have missed the boat 1998, like I heard this lady, Miss Packwood, say, just like it's no longer cool in America, the train has left that station a long time ago, right? So we want to continuously, and it is relative, talk about the white oligarchy and the strongholds, yes. But we must not relieve ourselves and the black leaders, our black leaders, of their responsibility. Because I had this report ever since the 70s. My recollection of the riots was, I was 4 years old. My father came and picked me up, you know, and took me to see that bus hanging over on TCD, right? 4 years later, my father was dead. My father also spent time incarcerated under interrogation for the same crimes that these two gentlemen, these honorable gentlemen, were murdered for. And I say honorable because if we can deem people honorable, you know, that continue to let us as a people down, we can deem them honorable too for standing up for a cause that would help to uplift the plight of black people in this country. So my question is, why now? And what is the objective? And as I heard you mention about education, Mr. Commission, you know, and you hit it in the head, you know, we must not relieve ourselves of the accountability, because from 1998 has came and gone, what have we done as a people? I continuously get condemned on a regular because of my articulation and wanting to hold my black leaders accountable, and that's okay. I don't bleed green, but I bleed empathy, empathy for my people, right? So when we look at, you know, wanting to relieve ourselves, we must get real and stop using a lot of this articulation to manipulate the emotions and the realities of what is being played on in the street.
Finalize your question.
Finish right up, right?
Yeah.
Mr. Parent Chief, you made mention about your discontent or your dismay, my words, in your early years with the PLP, right? Now, as the only party that I have supported, other than giving my vote to you, and 2007 was the first time, you know, I voted, I'm now looking at to say, like, where did we go from here? Because if we couldn't catch the train in 1998, what makes us think we can catch the train here in 2019 when we're economically got a noose around our neck? We could continue to blame it on the powers and the structure that was and still exists today, or we can stand up and get real and hold our own people accountable and see how we're going to move this thing forward.
Appreciate that, young man. Appreciate that. I just want to make a point that we've let the young man go on. Often we ask to hear from particularly our young men, one of the younger young men in the room, and we've heard from them. Yes?
Yes.
Appreciate it.
I would just want to thank you for having this happen. I want to thank the department. I'm concerned that I can count on 2 fingers those of our leaders who are in this room. This is a very important conversation, something that many of them could have learned from. And I want to thank you for your comment, Cordell, when you mentioned that, you know, Barbados woke up one day and the people said, we're going independent. We keep making this noise about the number of, 2511? If that isn't a mandate, what is? You know, and those of us who have fought all our lives, and you know, I fear that I will die attached to this queen. And it vexes me. It vexes me. And it's time that we realize, and I say, I know we hear your voice, Rolf, but they really ought to be in this room. Because, you know, we're not ready. And I want to say thank you to Maxine, because I too am an educator, and we were some of the people, the architects of the BSSC that was recognized in universities abroad. And we had to fight as education officers under Maxine, tried to fight to stop it from going away. But you know, our own people, one more time. So, you know, I don't know if I can be a blind follower much longer. I don't think I've ever been a blind follower, but I vote one way. I'm tired. I'm tired. And for, you know, the other educator, she's Sherilyn, talking about, you know, the passion of us. I too have taught recently, after retirement, at middle school and at the Berkeley, down at Clearwater and at the Berkeley, and meet children who are awesome young people. But we have to understand that our schools, our public schools, are a microcosm of our society. And we have a total mix in those schools. And it boggles the mind, it annoys me when I hear people get up and say, oh, this is not working and that's not working. Show me the data. Show me the problem. Because you're not in our system, you don't know what's going on, but you're about to have a big upheaval all over again. Many of us know about upheaval.
Indeed.
We went through it once. Please.
Indeed.
Thank you.
So much for our panel to, in a short time, reflect on as we wind up. Much to reflect on. Who would like to start the reflection and the answer of some of the questions and comments we've made in as short a possible manner that you can? Phil.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try to address the young men who voted for me. But in any event, all jokes aside, in respect of the where do we go from now?
Yes.
He's right, because I've asked that since 1995 on the issue of independence. And certainly, as Ellen Kate had just said, 2511 ought to be more than enough of a mandate to take all of the issues in the Pitt report and implement them. Let's just push them through. The opposition will come. It's always there. But we just need to push them through and do it. On the issue of independence, very quickly, I joined my friend in Scotland when the Scottish last referendum was held. Should they hold another one, I shall spend another month assisting as much as I can the Scottish independence movement. In fact, I met another independence movement at that time, the Catalan. There's some issues around it, but I will support every independence movement on this planet because it is a natural thing to do. I'm not going to go into it very deeply, but our premier, former premier, Alex Scott, mentioned it. The Bermuda Constitution Act is an act of Westminster Parliament. The Bermuda Constitution is a constitutional order. In fact, it's a schedule within our Constitution. As such, under the Bermuda Constitution Act 1967, Westminster Parliament, if and when it wanted, could make us independent tomorrow simply by revoking the order in council. I'll put it shortly that way, but constitutionally, when we have 47 legislators in this country, in quotes, passing a law, But one man up on the hill, the governor, should he not sign that into law, it would not be law. So, as I say, that has always been demeaning to me. From when I was 23 years old, I am now 75 years young, and I will not change from that one iota. But thank you, Ms. Moderator.
Thank you. Cordell.
I think I'll deal with three very shortly. You started off by asking the question about telling the truth, or we don't always tell the truth, or something along those lines. Well, the Pitt report addresses that as well. In there is a story about a candidate, a white candidate who was running for the Progressive Labor Party. And in his constituency, he asked a black member of the Progressive Labor Party to sign his form so that he can run. But the person said, as much as I support the PLP, I can't sign that form, because he was fearful of what could happen if his name showed up on this person's form. So I think there are two reasons why we don't tell the unvarnished truth. One is that because people don't like to hear it. The second one, of course, is what he was alluding to. There are ramifications when you do. And so as law, and in a small community where that fear was there, it's always been there, people will not tell you the truth. Now, we've had several media here. It's going to be very interesting to see how this meeting is going to be portrayed tomorrow, and I'll leave that there. The second thing I want to deal with is, I think Jonathan Starling asked about political will. Why don't we have it? It's the same reason, fear. During the first term of the Progressive Labor Party government, the focus was on the economy. And the reason I believe it was a focus on the economy is because prior to coming in, the view of the United Bermuda Party was those people can't govern. And so focusing on the economy was proving that we could govern. And that was done until 2008, when circumstances beyond the government's control pulled the rug from underneath them, and the very thing that they were fearful of was the thing that sunk us in 2012. Being fearful and trying to focus on managing the economy when the people that needed the help weren't focused on to the extent that they should have been. And there exists the possibility of that happening again. And the last thing I want to spoke on, and I'm going to be very brief with this one, and it's about education. About a month ago, I posted a note on all things politics, this formerly Bermuda, what was it called, Bermuda Election 2012. And what I posted was simply this: I'm a product of public education. My children are products of public education. Now tell me what's wrong with public education. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Mr. Commission.
Well, thank you. On the May 24th holiday, there was a photo going around of someone who's very prominent in the community. He was wearing it was a black Bermudian who was wearing a T-shirt that had a large Union Jack imprinted on it. Not what I call the bastardized Bermuda flag, as you people want to call it, which is based upon the Union Jack, but a Union Jack. So he had the Union Jack imprinted from the neck right down to his waist. And what was ironic here, in light of the conversation we're having about independence and coming out of the Pitt Commission report, is that the country that flag represents conferred upon us as what Mr. Philip Parent-Chief has said, has been this Council of Order that became what we call the Bermuda Constitution. And this was after, of course, the Constitutional Conference that was held prior to 1968, and then that Constitution was basically agreed upon, the contours of it, which, as I said, encoded white privilege politically in our system. The irony is that that Constitution, go from page 1 to the end, you won't find this word, Bermudian. In other words, the term Bermudian has no constitutional or legal reality. Now, does it have between us? Half of us or a third of us in this room are related on a familial or cultural basis, of course. But you won't find the word Constitution in your Constitution. I mean, you won't find the word Bermudian in your Constitution. You also won't find this word, citizen, because citizenship doesn't exist in Bermuda. But even some of my colleagues, even myself, I might slip, and you hear me saying it very cavalierly, Bermudian citizens. We're not a nation, but you also hear that bandied about. So that's what we're talking about, the fact from fiction. We have status, which is not citizenship. Again, so dealing with fact versus fiction. Now, in terms of lastly upon education, I formed part of that generation. I was the first black male to attend what we now call a white school. That was Mount Agnes, 1963. I was 6 years old. I spent my next 8 years in that school system. But that school system is part of a larger school system called the System of Education of Bermuda. Where are white Bermudians tonight to show you this? The same divide is taking place. And lastly, I'll leave with this. I talked about how white privilege was encoded in Bermuda's constitutional and political realities. Look at what the UBP was and what the UBP became. Look at what the OBA is today. So what you'll find is a party that derives 85% at least of its support from Bermuda's white community, which votes as a block, en bloc, every election, a conservative estimate, 85%, but yet 75 to 80% of its representatives are black Bermudians. Remember what you saw on that screen? Who was he flanked by to insulate him from the racism that he was projecting? That's the same reason. That's why I said the house that Jack built is still existing today. Thank you.
All right. What I'd like to do, Mr. Scott, is to have Madam Laverne and Mr. Barrett, and then as the member that sat on the commission, I'd ask you to wrap it up, and then the thank you from the minister, if I might.
That's quite all right.
You grant me that? Thank you.
Is this working? Okay. I would just like to say I'm a person that I am a believer in independence. I would like to see it happen in my lifetime, and I'm getting old now, so I don't know if it would. But I am, along with some others, in the process of organizing a forum on independence, which you will hear more about in a couple of weeks. I've already identified some people who have agreed to speak on the forum, and it should be happening within the next, what is this now, May? Hopefully by the end of June it will be ready to go on the road. So I do, not just talk.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barrett.
There's quite a lot to comment on, Rick, ladies and gentlemen, as to what's been said this evening. But as I reflect on what has been said, well, not just from the floor, but from the panel as well, I can't help but think this, that we are in desperate need of reform in this country. You can call it political reform if you like. We inherited a system, the Westminster system, which is upheld, but it is colonial in nature. It seeks, by its very nature, by the very way in which our house is constructed up there, to divide. to divide. One of the things that I've learned, and this is a pleasant lesson, since I've been out of politics and no longer actively involved, is that I have friends on the other side of the aisle, people with whom I can identify. Indeed, I used to identify with them when I was in the House, but politics, party politics, constrains you from crossing the aisle. You do that, you're either a traitor or you're weak, and you'll be punished for it. And we have a system here that encourages that. I'm going to tell you that I think in many respects, I know none of you intended that this evening, it's been reflected here this evening as well in terms of what people have had to say as to what they're concerned about, what they'd like to see. And we continue, at best, to talk at one another. To talk at one another. Very rarely do we talk with one another. Now, there's a lot of blame to be shared around on why that is so. And it has its roots in our history, deep in our history, going right back to 1620, and particularly with slavery and then segregation, and what white people were taught to think of black people, and what black people were taught to think of themselves and white people. And it's still with us today. There's no question about it. And we've got to find the means, the ways, if we are ever going to go forward together, to break that down. I commend Kerr for some of the what do you call those things? The reconciliation, the meetings they're having with different people, where people actually sit in a room and talk to one another and gain an appreciation. Because it's an incredible thing that in 20 square miles, we are a people apart in so many respects. And I'm not just talking superficially, because if we can get over that, then maybe we can start tackling some of these harder, what I call at the outset, harder, difficult issues. We may never agree on what the solutions are, but it would be of tremendous assistance if we could agree on the nature of the problem and one person could have an appreciation for why someone else holds that view. Now, I know that sounds perhaps trite, but I'm telling you, as I sit here this evening, it's been through all my life in Bermuda, and it's holding us back.
All right. Appreciate those comments. We wrap it up with the one member who sat on the Pitt Commission, the Honorable Alex Scott.
I'm standing just to prove to myself that I can.
And still standing.
And still standing. I really want to thank you as moderator. You did a good job. You done good. And for the department that put it on, you were inspired. Because I thought after 41 years, this was a subject that was behind us, behind me, and I realize now what I'm about to say. Every one of you in this room, and even this room, you are better off than you have ever been before in the context of this country and the history of this country. I began by talking about how important it was to be in this room because it's called Dr. Gordon's room. What he was fighting for then, he would be very, very satisfied, not that there wasn't more to do, but where we are now. When I came along, you couldn't go to schools that I was helpful in building the new Berkeley. When I was coming along, the idea of going to a university was a far-flung idea. Everybody here now holds a job that they wouldn't even been allowed to consider it many years ago. We have a preoccupation of where we've got to go as opposed to what we have accomplished. We are very hard on ourselves, but that's good. That's a good thing. That drives us to the next level and to the next level. But don't despair. Don't turn off a neighbor. Don't frustrate some youngster by telling them they don't have a good school. They could have a better school, but they have a better school than the schools we used to have. We have a better Bermuda than the Bermuda we used to have. We have a better opportunity now than we ever used to have. Doesn't mean we don't strive for more. The PLP is the government of Bermuda now. The PLP didn't even exist when I was coming along. And folks fought long and hard to see to it that they didn't exist when I was coming along. The young man that is the premier today was a babe when the Pitt Commission sat down to deliberate on the causes of the disturbance at that time. I've told him I made a mistake. He wasn't even born.
Idea.
My point is, intellectually, spiritually, socially, yes, strive for more. We must strive for more. But don't be so preoccupied with what we don't have so that we don't realize what we have achieved. People died. My friend Dame Lois, gone. Gene Cox, gone. Freddie Wade, gone. David Allen, gone. Brother Boris, gone. Nelson Boscombe, gone. I could be here. They died. Don't tell them that we still haven't achieved anything. Yes, we have. Yes, we have. There is tomorrow. That's for the younger folks. But for my part, for our part, for those in Parliament now, still we rise. And for that, Pitt Commission will prove to have been a watershed. There would not have been a PLP if there hadn't been a Pitt report. Why? Because for the first time, the powers that be were held to account. So thank you for causing us to look back. And don't anybody despair as we look forward. Thank you so much for coming this evening.
Fantastic wrap-up. Yep. It leaves me to ask the Minister Levita Fogel if she would come forward just to give some thanks and some congrats, but congrats to your ministry, Minister, for putting on the forum. And we note, as the director so aptly reminded me, it is on the anniversary of that Pitt report. That's why we are holding it, and hopefully the ministry will build on it.
Ready? Okay, I think I'll do this in my glasses. Good evening, everybody. I do want to thank you for coming out and being a part of this very important panel discussion. And let me just say very quickly, though this was not a mandate that appeared in the throne speech for my department, for the Department of Community and Culture, because we see many of the disparities that exist within our community, we thought it an important, I guess if you will, mandate coming from the people that we take this by the hand and try and open back up, if you will, a conversation with the view of that conversation leading to us as a people making some further inroads and steps in trying to bring about the changes like you see that the Pitt report called for, and making those changes a reality, so that if it would have the effect of many of the issues that these panelists have talked about this evening, having, if you will, every person sharing fairly in this economy would have the effect, in doing so, addressing some of the social ills that we see that plague our economy. And I can tell you that our department is committed to seeing that changes do take place through whatever exercises we can put forward to the people, like having this panel discussion here, so that it can bring about, I guess, if you will, some real movement in order to address the issues that prevail in our society. And I am glad, from what I could see from coming in here and listening to the participation, both from the floor as well as from the panelists, I guess as a people we are hungry for this because we recognize that something has to be done, if you will, to level the playing field. And so in us recognizing that, I guess I have to say that we are committed to continuing that charge. So, and I want to thank the panelists who are here this evening for taking the time out of their schedules, and I would say that all of them are fairly busy, to have this very critical and important discussion this evening. And as it relates to the Pitt report, because as has been pointed out, all of the issues that were highlighted in that report are the issues that prevail today. And so let me say specifically, thank you to the Honorable Alex Scott, who, as has been said, was a member of the Pitt Commission. Thank you to the Honorable John Barrett. Thank you to Ms. Laverne Farber. Thank you, Mr. Cordell Riley. Thank you to Mr. Ralph Commission and to Mr. Phil Parenti. And thank you to the moderator. And I have to say, and I'm going to say it here, and I might say it again at the end, I want to say thank you to the Department of Community and Culture. And thank you to Mackenzie. Laverne is telling me who else. Okay, thank you, Mackenzie. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Laverne, for stepping up to the plate to have what we all know is a very uncomfortable conversation for many people, but a very necessary conversation. And it's a conversation that we need to keep having, because we have to address that elephant in the room. It's not going away. In the late 1970s, Bermuda was rocked by 3 days of rioting following the hangings of Erskine Buck Burroughs and Larry Tacklin. Burroughs was hanged for the murder of George Dockett, the Commissioner of Police, Governor Richard Sharples, and the ADC Hugh Sayers. Tacklin was hanged for the murders of the supermarket owner Victor Rigo and Mark Doe. 3 people lost their lives. The economic cost was considerable, but the social cost was near catastrophic. The Royal Commission report, or the Pitt report, into the 1977 disturbances was released on July 14th, 1978. It was a comprehensive report with some instructive recommendations that have been discussed here this evening. For those of you who have attended this evening, I do hope that this was a thought-provoking occasion, and I hope it is one that will lead to further, as I've stated, conversation and even more. It was meant to provoke. It was meant to provoke thought. And so it was a very deliberate act. We can't forget, it is our collective history, and we've had the panelists up here speak to that. It's one that is our history, one that is an emotive, turbulent, and frightening time as it surrounded the riots of 1977. But you know what? We need to learn from that history, because from what I've heard this evening, the conversation suggests that lessons have not truly been learned. And so we need to learn, and we need to take steps to ensure that we begin to correct and make a better way for everybody. So, again, and Laverne told me not to be long, so you know how politicians are. We can be long, right? So I'm going to just stop myself, because there are other things that come to mind, but I think the panelists did a superb job. I really do. So thank you. Thank you. And I just want to take the time out to once again thank the department. We now call it the Department of Community Affairs, but there are some who say, no, you must keep that word culture attached to it as well. So I'll call it the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs. And in particular, our director, Heather Whalen, and the Folk Life Officer, Dr. Kim Dismont Robinson, for facilitating and organizing this discussion as a part of our Heritage Month observations, but more important, so as to awaken and the awareness in those of us that perhaps have not been aware before, and to further awaken the awareness in those of us who are aware but maybe have just let the baton drop. And so, and I thank you guys for accepting the challenge and for accepting this as part of your remit, because it is our remit. And we will continue it. And thank you for coming out and making this a success.